Welcome to the world's most contentious real estate dispute, a place where ancient scrolls are considered more legally binding than property deeds, and where DNA results are treated with the same enthusiasm as a tax audit. One might say it's the only place on Earth where people point to a 3,000-year-old pottery shard and declare with unwavering certainty, this proves my cousin from Brooklyn should have this apartment building in East Jerusalem. In 2010, a group of scientists committed what can only be described as an act of academic impertinence. They published actual genetic data about Jewish populations in the prestigious journal Nature. How inconsiderate of them. Dr. Doran Behar and his colleagues discovered something rather awkward. Ashkenazi Jews, who comprise approximately 90% of American Jews, and
So I just want to draw attention to this little graph here that I have up. And the name itself, Ashkenazi, that is, I don't know if they're like their tribe or whatever, or their descendants, or like how they refer, like they're the European Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews. Now, if you look at this, this is from the Bible. Okay, you look at Noah, and you have Shem with Abraham, that goes all the way down where we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then you have Japheth, Ashkenaz comes from Japheth. And then we have Tubal, Meshach, Gog, and Magog. That is the bloodline of Ashkenaz. Very interesting.
nearly 50% of Israeli Jews show
So they're not even of the line of Abraham,
European
Isaac, and
genetic
Jacob.
ancestry. One might say their DNA was pointing more toward Krakow than Jerusalem. The 2022 study by Waldman and colleagues went further, suggesting that Ashkenazi Jews derive approximately 40 to 50%.
All right, I'm going to see if this is ready. Nope, it's not. Oh, yeah, it is. All right, so what I have up here in front of us is an AI system called Notebook LM. This is one of the most insane systems that I've been using to basically disseminate information quickly and accurately. And on the left here, you guys will see, I have all of these are sources, from documentaries to PDF files of books, actual reports from government and UN documents, all sorts of stuff. But in today, I want to specifically, I've only checked a couple of these that are specific to the foundations of Zionism, and specifically kind of some of the more lesser known things about the history of Zionism that go unnoticed or unspoken in mainstream.
What
So
happens when historical records, really controversial documents and theological interpretations all collide? How do these
let's
totally
hear it.
different
I haven't
narratives
listened to
end
this
up
yet,
shaping
by the way. I
how
just
we
generated
understand
this.
the movement, its aims, and, well, its impact? Welcome to the deep dive.
That collision is exactly what we're digging into today. We've got this stack of sources provided to us, and we're going deep into the history of Zionism and also Christian Zionism,
Right.
looking at things like the personal diaries of Theodore Herzl, often called the father of modern political Zionism. And then there's that infamous and widely disputed document, the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion.
And we're not stopping there, are we? We're also looking into the dynamics of power, finance, international relations,
Yeah.
but specifically as they're presented in these texts.
Exactly. And the critiques, the alleged consequences that are discussed right there within the source material itself. Our sources for this, they quite varied. We have excerpts from historical diaries like Hossel's. We've got analyses looking at political strategy, public opinion, then the Protocols document itself. historical accounts focusing on Christian Zionism, and an analysis that looks specifically at settler violence.
So our mission for you, listening in, is pretty clear. We want to guide you through the landscape that these specific sources present, pulling out the key info, the different angles they offer. The goal is to help you get better informed by, highlighting maybe surprising details, exploring the different accounts. And this is crucial without us adding any outside info or taking sides on the viewpoints and the sources. We're just presenting what they say.
Our focus is purely on laying out the narratives, the information that's contained within this material we've been given, letting you see the different pictures they paint.
Okay, let's get into it. Starting with, what many see as a foundational point for modern political Zionism, these excerpts from Theodore Herzl's diaries. What did these really personal notes actually tell us about his vision and, the practical side of his early efforts?
Well, what's really fascinating, I think, is how the diaries give you this first-person window. You see the huge ambition, definitely, but also the very human, often quite frustrating, practical and political hurdles Herzl was up against.
So they're not just strategy documents.
Not at all. They're full of his thoughts, his struggles,
Yeah.
his moments of hope, but also despair as he's trying to actually make these ideas happen, to turn them into reality.
So based on what's documented in these diaries, what was the core of his vision and the strategy he was trying to use?
At its heart, Herzl's whole approach was driven by what was called the Jewish question. It was widespread discrimination, the persecution Jews faced in Europe. He saw territorial solution as the necessary answer.
He felt it was urgent.
Deeply. His diaries really reflect this profound sense of seriousness, of urgency. He even notes, sometimes with real frustration, what he saw as the political lethargy of some Jews, people he felt didn't fully grasp the dangers he saw coming. He describes his own project as being, quote, as serious as the situation of the Jews itself. That shows his conviction, right?
And how did he actually plan to achieve this goal, this territorial solution? What was the strategy?
His strategy was intensely focused, really high-level diplomacy, and trying to leverage finance. The diaries, they meticulously detail his attempts to get access, to get support from the most powerful figures of the day.
Like who?
Well, leaders like the Tsar of Russia. He hoped to arrange that meeting through the Prince of Wales, the German Kaiser, where he planned to use the influence of the Grand Duke of Baden, and crucially, the Sultan of Turkey, because the territory he was primarily focused on was part of the Ottoman Empire then.
He also went after the big money people, didn't he? The financiers.
Oh, absolutely. The diaries make it clear he saw financial power as just essential. He specifically mentions the Rothschilds. At one point, he expresses this almost, breathtaking belief that he could, quote, raise the whole money in one afternoon by a simple passage d'écriture.
Wow, just like that. A stroke of a pen.
That's what passage d'écriture implies, yeah. A simple transaction. But the diaries also show the harsh reality. He actually faced refusal from a Rothschild at one point. He had to consider seeking funds from what he called the Democrats of money, which suggests he needed to look beyond just that traditional elite.
That contrast is really something. The grand vision, all the money in one afternoon versus the day-to-day struggle.
Exactly.
So how did he frame the diplomatic side, especially with countries like the Ottoman Empire who actually controlled the land?
His approach there was all about offering significant financial incentives. He thought about proposing loans or even special gifts to countries like Argentina or Turkey if they'd cede territory. With Turkey specifically, his documented plan, right there in the diaries, it centered on offering to basically stabilize or even restructure the Sultan's finances in exchange for land.
He offered money.
A lot. He proposed paying a substantial annual tribute to the Sultan. Starting, he suggested, around £100,000, potentially rising up to £1 million a year.
Wow.
And he even suggested this tribute could be mortgaged against the loan he would raise. So effectively using future payments as collateral right now. He saw solving the Jewish question not just as, a humanitarian need, but as a way to potentially strengthen the Ottoman Empire, bringing them, as he put it, a river of gold, of progress, of vitality, if they just agreed to his plan.
Sounds like he was really thinking about every angle. Political, financial. What about the actual running of this proposed state? The diaries touch on that?
Well, yeah, he sketched out ideas for the basic structure. His notes mentioned establishing its own laws, having an army, managing its own finances.
Yeah.
Interestingly, especially coming from him, a journalist,
Yeah.
he planned for, quote, extensive but firm limits on public opinion, especially in the beginning. He said he valued press freedom, but felt this massive work
Speed
of building a state
it up a little
couldn't
bit.
be disrupted by what he called obtuse or malicious individuals.
Control the narrative early on.
Seems to be the idea.
Control the
Which
narrative
he notes himself as
early
kind of amusing
on.
and such a serious plan that Jewish newspapers back in Europe would gradually turn into Gentile papers as their editors emigrated. He also envisioned setting up institutions, like a state council of jurists, to draft the laws.
So a very detailed vision, but clearly he was hitting massive real-world roadblocks. How did the diaries show him dealing with all the skepticism, the opposition from within the Jewish community even, and the external stuff?
The diaries are absolutely full of those struggles. He writes about being dismissed as a pleasant dreamer. He talks about what he saw as political lethargy among many Jews. This difficulty they had, in his view, grasping the urgency or even understanding that someone might be driven by more than just, personal business deals.
He worried about that, being seen as self-interested.
Constantly. He worried about being suspected of pursuing his own financial gain. He had actively managed public perception, fight rumors like a false report that he'd simply bought a newspaper. He even wrote about the personal toll, calling it the tragedy of the leader, having to constantly push forward to lure people with fresh energy, even when he felt exhausted and was facing just endless toil and contention. The diaries really lay bare the huge personal cost.
Are there any specific moments, like anecdotes from the diaries, that really capture that tension?
Yeah, a few definitely jump out. His documented audience with the German Kaiser, that's a big one. Made even more symbolic because it actually happened in Jerusalem aboard the ship Imperator Nicholas II. Another really striking detail is his incredibly blunt description, in his private notes, mind you, of the Sultan's ministers. He calls them idiots and cowardly corrupt characters. A sharp contrast to how he viewed the Sultan himself.
He didn't hold back in private?
Not in the diaries, no. And maybe most telling is this entry where he described how difficult it was to raise just 1,000 francs, a relatively small amount for travel expenses for an associate. This is the same time he considered large amounts for the whole project to be basically assured. It just highlights that gap between the grand financial plans and the day-to-day scramble for actual cash.
Yeah.
And the entry where he notes publishing his first article in the Jewish Chronicle is the first step into the public arena. That clearly marks a moment he knew was pivotal.
Okay. So you've got Herzl doing these high-stakes, often really frustrating diplomatic and financial dances all across Europe and the Ottoman Empire, trying to, get a state created on paper. But what was actually happening on the ground in Palestine, the place he was focused on, during that same time?
Right, that's where the Al Jazeera source comes in. It gives us a perspective on that parallel process, the actual migration, settlement that was going on while Herzl was doing his diplomacy. And it describes a very different kind of activity than those high-level meetings Herzl was chasing.
What picture does that source paint about the early Jewish presence and the immigration?
Well, the source draws a distinction. It talks about the old settlement Jews versus the later Zionist immigration. These old settlement Jews, it says, were mostly traditional Jewish communities. Some had been there since the 18th century, maybe even earlier.
Okay.
And crucially, this source states that these groups were largely anti-Zionist. And they had pretty good relations, lived in pretty good company, it says, with the majority Arab population that was already there.
And the first wave that was actually tied to the Zionist movement?
According to this Al Jazeera source, the period from around 1904 up to World War I that saw the second immigration. And this wave, the source identifies as the first real Zionist immigration. But it also notes this initial wave wasn't immediately very successful. It claims over half, 50% of these immigrants actually went back to Europe within just 5 years.
Not exactly a roaring success initially then. What were these early Zionist immigrants doing, according to the source?
The source is quite specific. It describes them as building colonies. It explicitly says they call these settlements colonies, and that this activity was being funded by Jewish millionaires in Europe. These were the people, the source says, who were helping these early colonizers get set up.
It uses the word colonizers.
Yes, the source uses that term to describe the people being funded by the millionaires to establish these settlements, which it calls colonies.
Colonizers.
And the source goes on to characterize this whole process in a particular way. It presents this activity, the migration, the building of these externally funded colonies as being, quote, functionally a settler colonial process.
Functionally settler colonial. Why?
The source attributes this to it being driven by an ethno-national ideology, meaning an ideology where nationhood is really strongly tied to one specific ethnic or religious group, and their climb to territory is based on that identity.
And what did the source say were the consequences of this this process it calls settler colonial.
The source argues that this process, the settling and building colonies, inherently led to competition over land, over resources, with the people who were already living there. It describes this as creating a profoundly dialectical process, where opposing forces clash and interact.
Okay.
And the consequence, as the source presents it, is exactly the response that one can expect by competing over land with the people who live there. So it frames the conflict that arose as a direct expected outcome of this settler colonial dynamic, driven by that specific ethno-national ideology.
It's pretty impactful hearing the source use terms like colonies and settler colonial process for those early efforts, especially when you contrast it with Husserl's focus on diplomacy with European powers.
Yes, it really highlights that difference, doesn't it, between the sort of high-level political project Husserl and others were pursuing and the lived reality Jewish document claiming a secret conspiracy.
So the sources differentiate the type of document first and foremost.
Absolutely. For instance, the Mechanics of Political Power source, when discussing the challenges leaders like Husserl faced, it notes his personal struggles, like being suspected of having events, dramatizing key issues, all to shape how the public facilitating the freeing of Europe from its Jewish population.
So it served a purpose for Europeans, too, or alleged secret documents like the protocols or theological interpretations like Schofield's. It's a major thread running through all these sources, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
And we also have material on Edward Bernays, often called the architect of public opinion.
Yes, Bernays' work, as it's described in the source called Political Strategy, Diplomacy, Deceit, and Public Opinion, it provides this really significant theoretical framework for understanding how public opinion can be systematically manipulated, especially in politics. And it connects directly to these broader themes of influence we've been seeing elsewhere.
What were some of Bernays' core ideas about public opinion, about leadership?
According to the source, Bernays was, well, pretty cynical about the wisdom of the masses. He argued that the great political problem in our modern democracy is how to induce our leaders to lead.
Yeah.
He didn't think the voice of the people just formed naturally. He believed it was made up for it by the group leaders, specifically leaders who understood and mastered the manipulation of public opinion.
Politics as manipulation.
He saw politics as, quote, the first big business in America. And he argued that effective politicians need to actively mold and form the will of the people, using deliberate techniques. He essentially saw propaganda not as a dirty word, but as a necessary tool for political leadership, especially in a democracy. And Bernays advocated for a very methodical, almost scientific approach to this. He stressed needing a nearly scientific analysis of what the public desires,
sophisticated they could make that propaganda machine with AI.
And simplifying mass thinking.
And algorithms
he saw these as the
trained
basic
to
steps
brain
for any political
frickin'
campaign,
pathways.
any effort to get public support.
And what about controlling information? The role of PR within government?
The source details his belief that politicians can often effectively censor political news if they need to. He even proposed a concrete government position, a cabinet-level Secretary of Public Relations.
A Secretary of Public Relations? What do they do?
Interesting.
Well, their job would be partly to interpret America's
Pretty sure
aims
we
to
have
the rest
that.
of the world, but also, and significantly, to help regiment and guide the masses internally. The purpose, as Bernays described it, and the source relays, was to focus the public mind on crucial points of policy. How? Through what he called enlightened expert propaganda, achieved by carefully creating circumstances, highlighting certain events, dramatizing key issues, all to shape how the public perceives things.
Our source connects Bernays' principles specifically to lobbying efforts around Zionism, doesn't it?
That's exactly
yes.
what they're doing.
The source makes that explicit link. Now, the Bernays excerpts
Holy
themselves don't detail his personal views on Zionism or any direct work he did on it. But the source does note that Bernays' principles align with the strategies used in the extensive lobbying, the propaganda efforts, carried out by groups it calls Israel Affinity Organizations, or IAOs.
So these groups use his techniques.
The source states that these groups use techniques consistent with Bernays' theories to influence U.S. public opinion, influence political leaders in favor of the Zionist project. It also mentions that Bernays' own writings have apparently been cited elsewhere discussing applying these very propaganda techniques specifically to shape perceptions about Zionism. So that reinforces the connection the source is drawing.
Okay. And finally, we have the international Jew source, which also touches on influence, finance, media control.
This is written by Henry
But
Ford.
from a very different angle, one that, as other sources already told us, is highly prejudiced.
Yes, exactly. Similar to the protocols, the International Jew is presented in our sources as a document that's characteristic of anti-Jewish literature, described by other sources as a fictional product of a warped mind. It came
Yeah,
from a
except
newspaper
it's from
series
Henry
originally,
frickin'
and is
Ford.
framed where the contexts were given as a staple of anti-Semitic
Yeah,
pamphleteering.
Henry
Right.
Ford.
So understanding that crucial context, what are the
Henry
specific claims
Ford.
made within the International Jew source text as it's presented to us?
The document, as presented, makes these really sweeping allegations about Jewish power and control, especially in finance and media. It claims newspapers are dependent on Jewish advertising dollars, implying this dictates their content, what they can publish.
Okay.
It asserts that powerful financial interests have deliberately plotted to bankrupt the world and establish world peonage, echoing some things we saw in the protocols. It alleges that the propaganda pushing communism is entirely in the hands of Jewish agents. It makes strong claims like, the Jews were the directors and strategists of the Marxist revolution in Germany. The text also contains these statements that portray Jews as inherently destructive or as seeking domination. It includes a really controversial quote attributed to a Jewish author. The quote says, "We Jews, we the destroyers, will remain the destroyers forever. We will destroy because we need a world of our own." It also claims the coming world revolution will be exclusively our affair and will rest in our hands. This revolution will tighten the Jewish domination over all other people. It talks repeatedly about the terrible power of the purse, capitalistic, being wielded by Jews wherever they gain influence. But again, it is absolutely crucial, just like with the protocols, to remember our sources place the international Jew squarely in the category of anti-Jewish propaganda, classics of anti-Semitism. We are presenting the claims as found within that source text while relying entirely on the other sources provided to give us that critical context about its nature and origin.
Absolutely. Now let's pivot slightly and look at how some of our sources discuss the consequences or offer critiques related to these movements and activities we've been exploring. What picture do the sources paint when it comes to outcomes or criticisms?
Several sources do address impacts and critiques, yeah. Each one gives a specific angle based on their analysis of either the historical processes or specific actions.
We touched on the Al Jazeera source earlier about the early settlement. How does it elaborate on the consequences of what it called a settler colonial process?
Right. The Al Jazeera source really reinforces that characterization. It describes the Zionist process as functionally a settler colonial process, driven by that ethno-national ideology. It argues the direct consequence of this specific type of colonization was unavoidable competition over land with the people already living there. This, it says, led to discriminatory reasons, suggesting investigations need to actively consider that motive. And it discusses this concept of a collective right to the truth about these investigations, arguing that transparency, thoroughness, they're necessary for democratic function, for accountability.
Yes.
So victims and society as a whole can know what happened and whether justice was actually pursued.
So looking across all these sources then, we really see a huge range of perspectives on historical events, on ongoing dynamics. You've got